So my next point is educational leaders. Actually, that's only my second point under the 20th century. You might have had, educational developments. We talked about progressive education, psychology, the public school decline, and then the rise of Christian schools. And now, educational leaders. Under the rise of Christian schools is where we talked about the moral unrest and the explosions of schools in the good way, and the associations. So then number 2, educational leaders. We mentioned one would be John Dewey. We already mentioned him, John Dewey, father of what we might say, the father of progressive education. And I might as well give you right after him Mortimer Adler. Mortimer Adler, not Mortimer Snerd. Mortimer Adler, A-D-L-E-R. He lived from 1902 to 2001. He wrote many books, but the one I would want to point out is his book called Reforming Education. Reforming Education. Is this where he called for... he's the one I said modified Dewey's ideas, or claimed that Dewey didn't mean what happened in public education. How many of you have ever heard of the great books? Has anybody ever heard of the great books or a great books education? Okay. Adler is the one who said which books were great books. I mean, he's a current day philosopher in education, and basically a great books education is a conversation with the past where you read Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all the great authors and philosophers of the past. And so if you're reading them, you're reading Plutarch and Euclid and all that. You're getting a real broad education, more of a classical style education. So Adler, Reforming Education, modified Dewey's ideas. J. Gresham Machen. I don't know what his first name was. Went by his middle name. Gresham, G-R-E-S-H-A-M, Machen, M-A-C-H-E-N. He lived from 1881 to 1937. He was a Presbyterian, I believe. He taught at Princeton and quit or was fired from Princeton because they were going liberal, and he started with some other men Westminster Seminary. And he was much involved in education, probably in these schools like the National Union of Christian Schools as a Presbyterian. And he spoke in Congress a few times. If you read the book, Education, Christianity, and the State, Education, Christianity, and the State is a compilation of his papers and some speeches of his. And one in there is his speech before a certain Senate committee or congressional committee on whether or not we needed to have a separate Department of Education. So I think that was in 1917. Remember I said we didn't have a Department of Education until 1979 or 77, something like that, but we were talking about it way back then. Of course, in 1917, the world was just about perfect until we found out in World War I that it wasn't. He's influential in education. Maria Montessori. Maria Montessori. Anybody ever heard of a Montessori school? Okay, Montessori schools. She was tremendously successful in teaching special needs children. Of course, when she lived, special needs children were just kind of not given any education. Felt like they were a weight on society and a blight and all of that. She would take these children and teach them, and had tremendous success. Obviously not teaching them what we could learn here, but they weren't getting any education, and she was able to teach them. So by caring for them and working with them, what did they know? Okay, what could they do? And she cared about them. And surprisingly, you care about people and see what they can do, and they can do more. It's not surprisingly, obviously. But I can't remember exactly the time frame, but public education was not succeeding super, or some people just thought, well, if she could do that well, whatever she's doing could be used with normal children too. Okay. So that's a generality. It might be an overgeneralization, but generally a Montessori school is applying principles that used with retarded children on regular children. That sounds bad. That's kind of what I think of it, though. I mean, I'm not retarded. I don't need to be taught like a retarded person. Sure, those tools, having kids actually trace letters, can help them learn how to write. But I didn't have to, I mean, like put their hands through grooves of where they could feel what the letter was like rather than just see it and make their hand do it. Things like that. Motor skills. I didn't have that. They're helpful, I believe. Use your hands with it is good. But anyway, so Montessori can be good, but basically they applied principles that worked with special education kids to common education. Jean, J-E-A-N, Piaget, P-I-A-G-E-T, Piaget. J-E-A-N, first name, last name, P-I-A-G-E-T, Piaget. He was a psychologist, or I don't know if he was a psychologist, but his contribution to education is a psychological one. He popularized, or his theory of development, called developmental theory, became quite popular, and we'll talk about that next semester. But basically saying that stages of human development from 0 to 2, you go through several stages, and then from 2 to 4 or 5 more stages, and 5 to 12 more, and then 12 on. It's called developmental theory, and was kind of influential. C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, quite an influential philosopher. I call him a philosopher, a modern philosopher. He's kind of an enigma, I would say. He says a lot of things that are really, really good, and he says a fair amount of things that aren't good at all. Okay? But he's definitely not a Baptist. He had a Catholic background and converted, if you want to call it that, to Christianity, but that was like Anglicanism, which isn't much different than Catholics. There's people that are serious about it, and people that I agree with on what the gospel is. I disagree on whether they think he's saved or not. Some say there's no way he could be saved. Others say he probably was saved. Okay? So I'm trying to say, if you don't like C.S. Lewis, you can find plenty not to like about him. If you like him, you can find plenty to like about him. Okay? And I want to be balanced here. We shouldn't just say, oh, C.S. Lewis, evil, don't ever read anything. Okay? We should have brains that, hopefully, you're getting brains, your brains are developed and your convictions are firming up that you can read something that's not actually completely true and recognize what's not true in it. Okay? You do have to, young people should be careful with him because he's masterful. He's a tremendous writer, very powerful writer. And so there's some things that he writes that are just beautiful and expressed in ways that is just super. That's why people like to read him and quote him, because he's good at it. Okay. I mention him because if you do any study in Christian education, you're going to see his name. And I don't mention him so that you say, "Ooh, evil. Whoever quotes him is evil." Just, he's there. You're going to have to use your own discernment, compare what he says with the Bible. If what he says is true and pictures it in a great way, you can be helped by that. Dorothy Sayers. Dorothy Sayers is a literature teacher, something like that, in England. I just mentioned her. She gave a speech which was turned into a paper in the 60s, early 60s, where she talked about how, and she's from England, did I say that? So it's how in English schools they had lost the tools of learning. They had decided no longer to give kids the tools of learning and just to give them the learning. She gave this speech about this, and in her speech, or her paper, she said, we've lost the tools of learning, and that's not what education is about. Education is about giving people the tools to learn. We're never going to be able to teach them everything, so we need to teach them to learn. And she also said, and she said, classical educators gave people the tools to learn, and she made a comparison between child development and the trivium. If you remember the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So she made a comparison between child development and the trivium, in that she said that children in their youngest ages are strongest at memory, and that's mostly what grammar is. And she said that they are like parrots. They just repeat anything they're told, and so give them a foundation in grammar, and then they get some pert into this. She said parrot, pert, and poet. Pert was the guy that's always asking questions and saying why, and that corresponds to logic. Okay, and then the rhetoric is the poet. Okay, well, so she gave this speech. She recognized that education was failing. It had lost the tools of learning, and she corresponded the trivium with the development of children. All right. I think you have enough to take the test. I only have like 4 or 5 more points. So you might, Douglas Wilson, I mentioned him, Bob Jones Sr., the Hortons, you should know who the Hortons are. Everybody know who the Hortons are? Becca Horton, Pensacola, Becca Books. Tim Hortons, yes. Hortons a who or something like that? Okay. 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 Okay.